Hello, and thank you for joining me for the AASL Learner Standards Year 2 of the Knox County Schools Library Media Services 3-year standards rollout. I'm Amber Mosier, and I'm going to be chatting with you for the next hour and a half to help you understand a bit more about our standards and get to know some tools that you can use to help you with your planning and understanding of the standards, as well as become more collaborative with your peers. I wanted to take a moment just to recognize and show some appreciation for the curriculum team members that have worked so diligently on this process for the last year. We've had a great team coming together and trying to design the very best tools for Knox County Library Media Specialists, and I am very, very proud of the work that they've done. Today, for this session, we are going to be using the curriculum team's work, and we are going to be aiming to conquer these 3 objectives as we move through the session. Our first objective is to reflect on Year 1 and understand Year 2 of the AASL standards implementation. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, if you were a new hire this year and you weren't with us for Year 1, that is okay. We have some materials for you to lay that foundational groundwork for you. If you haven't yet viewed the Year 1 recorded session, I would suggest that you stop this video and access the Year 1 video so that you'll have a better understanding. If you've already watched that video, or if you attended some training that we offered over the summer, then I do believe you're ready for Year 2. For those that don't know, we have stretched out our standards implementation over 3 years so that we could have our very best shot of going at a pace that will allow us to truly absorb what we're doing. And so this session has us right smack in the middle of that in Year 2. Our second objective for today's session is to become familiar with the new Knox County Schools Library Media Services planning tools. And our third objective is to plan for engaging with those planning tools that are in the workbook. Now, you're going to hear me use the phrase the workbook quite often, and the workbook is simply a set of digital tools that the curriculum team developed so that we could help facilitate your planning and make pulling together all the strands that go into a successful library media specialist lesson together. That way you're not having to go to 4 or 5 different websites or pull up some old print documents that you have. We've tried to co-locate all those things to make your planning a little more efficient. So these are our 3 objectives for this session. Let's get started. Reflecting back to the Year 1 process that I alluded to earlier, let's talk a little bit about where we've been. In Year 1, or Phase 1, that was during the 2018-19 school year, and we knew that at that point we were in a phase called instrumental knowers. We were looking for the basics, and we weren't quite ready to claim mastery yet. We were just getting our feet wet and trying to get to know what these new standards were all about. And how we approached that is down in the teal part of this box. We had a committee that did a lot of heavy lifting on that initial work. We spent some time really believing and focusing on the common beliefs. And if you've forgotten what the common beliefs are, there are those 6 statements that accompany the standards. You can find them in the AASL standards workbook, or handbook, the publication from AASL. You can find them online on AASL's standards page within their website. If you have the large placemat printout of the standards that I gave to you, you can find them printed on the back. We were striving to gain some familiarity with all standards. Notice that doesn't say mastery. We were trying to gain just a basic understanding. But alongside of that, we tried to gain a deep knowledge, and we called that our major. I asked folks to major in one shared foundation, that's one column on the standards chart, and then to develop a growing knowledge in a second shared foundation. We called that our minor. So folks were walking around holding in their heads one shared foundation that they really understood and felt like they could hit the ground running with, and they worked to refine and develop understanding of that shared foundation, and then they chose another one that they really needed to grow in. So we were constantly using our strengths and our challenges to grow in these standards. The last, or not the last thing there, but near the bottom, it says that we were to curate library and creative objectives within the major shared foundation. We had a digital repository where folks were encouraged to share the objectives that they had written as they were using various standards to craft their lessons. We had mixed success with that. We had a few super users who were very, very generous and sharing their hard work with us. We had some folks that didn't really use it at all, but that document is still out there, and we're going to see a reference to it in just a few minutes, so you may find it useful as you're trying to plan your lessons. We practiced something called elevating lessons, where instead of simply tossing out a lesson that you'd had success with in the past, we simply added a standard to that, and it may have changed the focus or some parts of the design of the lesson, but we kept the basic idea so that you could still use products that you were comfortable with and that your students benefited from, but also raise those up to the rigor of the new standards. We also practiced writing objectives, and we used Bloom's taxonomy to help us craft those. We did this because we recognized that some of the wording of our standards is a bit dense and thick, and at times can be difficult to translate down to some of the younger students that we teach. So we used objectives as a way to carve out an age-appropriate, standards-driven lesson that would help us move closer to mastery by the end of 12th grade, because as you know, that's how these standards are written. They are written for mastery by the end of 12th grade, but all along a student's career from K up to 12, we are steadily making progress towards that mastery. So objectives were our major tool for accomplishing that. So now let's talk about where we're going forward. If our goal is for Knox County students to be prepared and competitive as they pursue personal interests, K-12 academic projects, and college and career, then we've got to do a little bit more learning and a little bit more implementation on our end. By the way, these three bullets that you see on the screen now, this is the entire reason that we adopted these standards and have been aggressively promoting them throughout our department and throughout our county. We believe that the competencies laid out on the standards can make a big impact on whether a student can effectively pursue personal interest, whether they can efficiently work towards their K-12 academic projects, and whether they're prepared to enter college or a career in the workforce. That's why we're so passionate about these. So in looking forward, in helping us carry out that passion, we have some plans for this year. So if you were around in the 18-19 school year, you saw some tentative plans for how we were going to move through the 3-year phases of the standards rollout. But as we've been working through these, we've seen the need to shift a little bit. So the teal and orange box on the right holds what we have revised and what we'll be working towards during the 1920 school year. So you'll see on there that we will be using a workbook template. Again, there's that workbook I mentioned. That workbook has some associated supporting documents. You'll be using all of those things in conjunction to create a planning guide for yourself. We want to encourage collaborative work amongst the librarians in the county. We have lots and lots of expertise out there. The only problem is we're scattered out in 80 some odd different schools. So if we can use some of the digital anatomy of Google Drive and Google Docs and things like that, we'll get a little bit closer to becoming more collaborative. And we're finally going to talk about something called Equip Task Alignment. Equip is a protocol wherein teachers and other professionals can examine lesson plans, lesson delivery, and student work to see if the teacher had clear and concise ideas of what the lesson was supposed to accomplish and whether or not that actually happened. If you were to look up the Equip protocol, you would find lots and lots of documents and forms. We are not going to be taking the Equip protocol to the level that you might find online. We won't be stepping through that protocol in lockstep. Instead, we're going to take some of the ideas that are in there and apply those to our daily work. Okay, so let's talk for just a minute about kind of where the idea for this workbook. And I know you haven't seen it yet, but I do want to tell you a bit about where and how it was born. So I was simply in the room a couple of times when some supervisors were having conversations about instructional materials. And when I say instructional materials, I'm talking mainly textbooks. And what I was hearing from them was very different from my experience as a former classroom teacher. When I was a classroom teacher, my experience was that textbooks might be helpful. They might have your curriculum covered in them, or they might not. It's just kind of hit or miss. Use them when you can, invent something else when you can't. And that was kind of my attitude towards textbooks. But what I was hearing from these other folks was that research, and you can look at this research here if you'd like, research has discovered that the quality of a textbook really matters. Now, we know that in theory, but lots of us haven't really seen it play out that way in practice. So that got me to thinking about textbooks in the context of a library media specialist. And I don't think we'll ever see a textbook for our particular content area. I'm not sure I would want one, but it did make me wonder about some of the ancillary things that come with a textbook, like a teacher's manual. What might that look like? What guidance might that provide for folks? And so I got to thinking that since we probably won't ever see a library textbook, what's the closest approximation that we could make for one? And that's how this idea of a workbook was born. So in just a few moments, I'm going to share the workbook with you. I'm going to tell you how to find it and what you need to do with it to get it set up for your daily work. But first, I want to express one of the very, very most critical and basic purposes of this workbook is so that you can design your own curriculum. As you know, we have lots of different scheduling scenarios throughout the county. We have some folks who see children every day, some don't. We have some folks that see children every 3 days, some folks that see children every 10 days. It's very difficult to develop a curriculum for all those various scenarios. So what we've done is we've handed you the tools so that you can make something that is customized for your particular environment and program. So you're going to be taking the standards that we have and you're going to be weaving them. That's what all these colored strands are for. You're going to be weaving them into a curriculum that can help direct and guide your instruction on a daily basis. Okay, so let's start looking ahead into year 2. These bullets aren't in any particular order, but we'll just start at the top. So you're going to continue building relationships with the other folks who are in your building and hopefully across our department with other librarians who are engaged in the same type of work that you are. We know collaboration is what really drives some of our very best encounters with students and teachers, and so we're going to continue striving towards that. You're going to maintain your programming and reading promotion, and you're going to continue maintenance of your collection. We're not asking that anyone give up all other facets of your library program. Instead, we are simply focusing on standards alongside these other important things. So you're going to keep those 2 up. And in orange there, we see the standards talk, which is what we're here for, that when you are engaged in instruction, and for some folks that's more frequent than others, but when you are, you should teach from all 6 shared foundations and all 4 domains. Every lesson should be rooted in an AASL standard, or to use the language of the framework, a competency. Now, as I read that out loud, I don't want to give anyone the impression that every lesson has to have something from all 6 shared foundations and something from all 4 domains. No, instead, any lesson that you teach should have a very strong root in the standards. So hopefully that clarifies that a bit. And of course, that famous last bullet there, other duties as assigned. We know that you have lots of other things on your plates, and we do understand that lots of your time and attention will be devoted to those. Okay, in just a moment, I promise, we are going to get to see the workbook, and you're going to get to locate and manipulate your very own copy. But before we do that, I want to talk just a little bit about some different terms that the folks who were around for year 1 spent a lot of time defining and making sure that we speak about the correct one when we mean to. And there are 3 terms that get tangled up constantly in all areas of education, and they are standards, curriculum, and objectives. You're going to hear those terms quite often throughout the year as we talk about working with our standards and as you work in your standards workbook. So let's take just a moment to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So standards are a description of what a learner should know or do by the end of their school career. So our standards, Tennessee State standards for math and ELA, science and social studies, other standards for various content areas such as CTE, art and music, all of those standards are written to be kind of the ultimate achievement by the end of the senior year in high school. Okay. Now, we know that those standards aren't necessarily a word-for-word, or they don't have a word-for-word application for some of our younger grades. So that's where curriculum comes into play. That's where we take those standards and we break them down. Sometimes people refer to this as unpacking standards, but we break them down and we make them more accessible to the age group that we have in front of us. Now, along with that is the idea that we need to place them in a particular sequence. So if I'm a math teacher, I need to make sure that I teach place value and base 10 concepts before I can successfully teach addition and subtraction. So we have to sequence things in a sensible order. So those things are curriculum. That's the age level appropriate tasks and the sequence that they're arranged in. And then the more granular piece of that is objectives, which we talked about just a few minutes ago. And objectives are concise statements that convey the desired outcome of a specific lesson. So these come into your daily work. So I kind of think of it as standards define kind of the outcomes of the entire school career. Curriculum usually defines how a particular grade is going to progress, and objectives drive my daily work, sometimes my hourly work, depending on what kind of schedule I have for the day. So we're really going from broad to specific. Okay. We're going to hear all three of those terms as we get to know this workbook, so let's dive right in. Oops, I forgot my fancy things there. Okay, the workbook. Each person in the Library Media Services Department has a folder that has been shared with you in Google Drive. You must be logged into Drive using your Knox County Schools credentials. You won't find it in any personal Google Drive accounts that you have. You'll be able to locate this folder in your Shared with Me section over on the left sidebar. You'll find a folder that has your name and AASL Standards Workbook. Or it may just have your name, your first name and last name. Some of you got it shared one way and some of you got it another one. You will see that it was shared from me, Amber Mosier, and that should help you identify that folder. You're going to see when you open up that initial folder that there are lots of other files and folders nested inside. We did that purposefully so that there is a structure and a hierarchy in there so that we can navigate through these documents easily. The place we're going to start today, and will probably be your starting place for most times that you interact with the notebook, is a document called the Table of Contents. I'm going to get out of this presentation and get over into my workbook files so you can follow along as I navigate to the table of contents. So if you'll give me just a second. Okay, so here's my workbook. Okay. This first folder here, it's got the pound sign in front of it. That's so that Google would shoot it to the top of the list. The home base table of contents is where I'm going to begin. That was just a folder. The actual document is inside here. Now, if you haven't opened this before, your document is going to look something like this. Lots of red text on here. Your table of contents is going to have lots and lots of pieces of text that are linked to other files and documents within your folder structure. Oops. So when we get back out here, these pieces of text that you saw in the table of contents, they're going to link into some of these documents that are living in these other folders. So in order to create those links, you simply have to follow the directions that are in the red text. Over here on the comments box, it'll pop up in just a second. Okay, this, if you expand the comments, it'll tell you more about how to go about linking in case you forget. But all you do is follow the file names in the red text and then link those up with the hyperlinks that Google Drive generates for various documents. So, excuse me. Section 1 here, the workbook spreadsheet scope. Okay, so this piece of text needs to be linked to, now there's a convention here. This is folder 1, and then the name of the file, KCS LMS K-12 Workbook Scope. So I'm going to go back, folder 1, open it up, aha, KCS LMS K-12 Workbook Scope. That's exactly what I was looking for. I'm going to control click on the name of the file. I don't even have to open it up, and I'm going to get a shareable link. Now, I want to be able to edit my own work, so I'm going to leave this setting as can edit. I'm going to copy the link, and then I'm going to navigate back to the table of contents. I'm going to highlight the black text. That's what I want to be hyperlinked. And then I'm going to go up to the hyperlink tool. Click here. It wants me to enter the link to jump to. I hit apply. And now when I click on this text, it's going to take me straight to this particular document. Now that I've done that, I'm going to take off that red text to let me remember that I'm finished with that one. All right, if I come down to section 2, for letter A, I can see that, oh, this is a text header. There's no link here. So all I need to do is delete the red text. I have noticed that sometimes when I just like highlight all the red text and delete it, it wants to sometimes shift some of the lower lines up to the upper lines, and then it wants to renumber things, and I don't really like that. It didn't do it in that particular example, but what I have found that to be helpful is if I just delete one letter at a time, if I just put my cursor back here and delete, 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 it's less likely to jumble things up. So that might be helpful for you to keep in mind. So if I'm going to link up this next letter here, and you can see how this convention relates. I'm in section 2. Subsection A, document A. Look at my convention here. Section 2, subsection A. I actually want document AB. So I'm going to find that back in my, oops, got a little out of whack here. I'm going to find this back in my folder structure. So remember, I wanted folder 2. That was the first thing on my naming convention. So I'm going to open that. It was subsection A and document AB. Right there it is. So the folder structure naming matches the outline naming on your table of contents. So I'm going to get my shareable link. Copy that, go back to my table of contents, link up that black text, then I'm going to come out here and get my red text off. I'd like for you to pause the video now and spend some time linking up the remainder of your table of contents. The first couple might take you a minute to get used to it, but after that, you'll be able to just zip right through them. So take a few minutes, link those up, and then please come back to the video. I'm glad you're back. So now that we have our workbooks ready to use, let's talk about how to do that. The workbook consists of several different parts. The very first part that you'll see is just like in a traditional book, we've got some formatter. We have a preface. We have some information on how to use this workbook and some information on implementation. So please take some time to read those. One of the things that I think is really important to point out here is that this workbook is the intellectual property of Knox County Schools Library Media Specialists. Several folks have worked really hard on this over the past year and a half, and so we want to honor their work just as we would with any other publication and make sure that we keep the use of this workbook within the Knox County schools. Some of you may have friends in neighboring districts who may reach out for some help or assistance, or want you to share any useful things that you have. Although it will be tempting to help your dear friend, we cannot do that. We want to make sure that we honor our intellectual property, and so we do ask that you keep this document within the Knox County schools. All right, the next thing down on your workbook in section 1 is something called the scope. Now, if you come from teacher world, then you are probably quite familiar with what a scope is. If you haven't been a classroom teacher in the past, then this may be an unfamiliar term to you as it's used in education. So a scope is a document that is included in textbooks. It's usually one of the very first things you see when you open the front of the textbook, and it tells you what content will be covered in this particular textbook. So in K-12 education, that generally translates to what will be covered in this grade. So for instance, if I am a 6th grade social studies teacher, the scope may show me that we will be beginning with ancient Greeks and moving through ancient Chinese cultures, and then on to ancient Romans, and then on to the Byzantines, and then we will finally end with the Holy Roman Empire. In math, it might start, let's say this is 8th grade algebra. We might start with variables. We might start and then move on to balancing equations, and then eventually end up with using the distributive method. I don't know much about math, but I'm sure it's easy to figure out that the scope is simply defining the beginning and end point of the content in a given document. So one of the tools that you have here in the workbook is the structure for creating your own scope. And I have a little model here that shows kind of the concept behind a scope. Where do we start in kindergarten, and how do we build on that so that we can help the student reach full mastery by grade 12? Depending on what grade band you teach, your scope is going to be targeting a different part of this ladder. Some of you will be down here in elementary, middle will be somewhere around the center, and high school you'll be getting towards the end of the ladder. I'm going to pull up an example of an organization that has provided a really good scope that I thought would resonate with each of you. I'm going to pull up Common Sense Media, and I want to take a look at what they've created here. So we've got a lot of preface materials, but then we get into the scope and sequence of their digital curriculum. So as you can see, this page is for grades K1 and 2. They have different strands of learning, and I can tell that simply by looking at their key up here. And it shows underneath that Unit 1 will consist of these 5 lessons. And these 5 lessons all fit somewhere within some of these strands. Okay. I can see in Unit 1 there is an internet safety lesson, there is an information literacy lesson, there is a privacy and security lesson, more information literacy, there's creative credit and copyright in one lesson, and there is relationships and communications in another lesson. As I scroll down through these other units, I see some of those same topics repeated. Now, in grades 3 through 5, in Unit 1, I can see that they have a different set of lessons that are slightly more complex. Some of the same themes are incorporated into those lessons, but if we look at the difference between this first internet safety lesson, how do you go places safely on the computer, versus the first safety lesson here, what should you do when someone uses mean or scary language on the internet, we can see a bit of a progression. In grades 6 through 8, if we find their first safety lesson here, how should you handle inappropriate online talk? Okay, we're still kind of keeping with the same theme, but we're moving up in sophistication of the topics covered. And then if we get up to grades 9 through 12, their first internet safety lesson is how can you tell when an online relationship is risky. So basically what we're seeing here is a development of these key concepts across different grade bands. That's what a scope does. And so you are going to be creating something similar, not similar in appearance, but similar in functionality for your program. I'm going to navigate back here, and we're going to move on to the next section. Now, as you've heard me talk about the scope, and as you've just seen the example on Common Sense Media, you may have had some questions start to develop in your mind. Questions such as, well, what might that look like in a fixed schedule, like most of our elementary schools? Or what might that look like in a flexible schedule? Many of our secondary schools and a couple of our elementary schools are on flexible schedules, and if I don't see my students on a regular basis, how can I define the different topics that I'm going to teach? Oops. And how frequently I'm going to review those specific topics. So that might be a little puzzling for some of you. So what we're going to do now is simply talk about how to approach some of those questions. Before we do that, I'm going to pull up an actual copy of the scope. You may have already located yours in your folder, and that is completely fine. My scope and your scope too. Got to back out a few folders here. Excuse me. It lives in folder 1. It's actually the only document in there, so it's nice and simple to find. All right, so here's my blank document that I can use for building my scope. So let's talk about this for just a minute, and then we're going to come back to those questions about how might this look in fixed versus flex. Your scope has, I want to skip down to row 3 for just a second. These are the learner standards, just like the ones that are printed on the placemat. They're actually going in a different orientation. Your printed ones are vertical, and this is horizontal just because of the nature of using a spreadsheet, but the text is still the same. Excuse me. So you've got all of the think competencies in Inquire. I'm down here in the Inquire tab. You've got all of the create competencies, all of the share competencies, and all the grow competencies. When you click to another shared foundation, you've got the same things, only with the text that's appropriate for that shared foundation. Up in row 2, you see the school librarian framework standards. You may or may not know that the AASL standards have 3 layers. What most folks have been focusing on nationwide are the learner standards, which is what you see in row 3. There's also a framework for librarian standards. Those standards remove your attention out one level and help you to see, okay, if I want students to do these things, what sorts of things does the librarian need to do? The third tier, which is not on here, we will introduce it at some point, but it is a school library standards and a framework. And so, again, the structure is if we want learners to be able to do X, then librarians have to be doing Y, and a library has to be set up in order to do Z. So it aligns learners, librarians, and library resources, instructional time, and attention so that we can ensure that those things are happening. But we're going to focus on the learner standards for now, row 3. Over here to the left, we have what this could look like and you can fill this in for the grade bands you teach. Some of you will have kindergarten and first, or you might have, I'm going to go over here to collaborate. If you're a high school person, you might have 9 or 10, but I'm not sure in secondary that the 9, 10, 11, 12 is especially helpful. And that takes us, it allows us to circle back to those questions we asked a few minutes ago. How would this look in a flexible schedule versus a fixed schedule? What I've heard some secondary librarians say is that rather than think of how these different standards would look in different grade levels, they have instead thought about this as kind of mapping out a continuum to mark degrees of exhaustiveness. So instead of thinking about, what might this look like in 11th grade, you could view it as, what might this look like in an introductory phase? Maybe a teacher's bringing her class in for the very first time. And then maybe when they come back next time, what might this look like at an intermediate level of mastery? And finally, once the students have been in a sufficient number of times, what might this look like in full mastery? That might be helpful for you. I think secondary is unique in working with a tool like this simply because, well, not simply, it's pretty complex actually, but one of the issues is that sometimes you have, especially elective courses that have kids from all different grades in there. Or you have a student that you've never seen before in your life sitting beside a student who's been brought in there 8 times already by his or her science teacher. So you're constantly working with students who are at various levels. So I want you to think about how something like this might best serve you. And the reason I want it to serve you is so that it can serve your students. I don't want anyone sitting down and filling in this scope as just an exercise in checking something off of your list. Rather, I want you to think about how this might enhance your planning and use it that way. If that means that you maybe use this scope more as a conversational tool that you can put in front of teachers as you're planning collaboratively, do that. Or if it means that I'm going to define what students should be able to do in this grade, this grade, this grade, and this grade so that I know how to design my instruction when I sit down to do my planning, then do that. This tool is for you. Now I do have some samples here that are also tabbed out on the bottom. I'm going to pull up my elementary sample. This sample is from the Inquire Shared Foundation. And what I did was basically what I've been describing as we've been going along in this session. I took the very first competency in Inquire, which is learners display curiosity and initiative by formulating questions about a personal interest or a curricular topic. And I said, okay, how is that going to look in each of the grades that I teach? I tend to do better if I can backwards plan. I like to think about what the ultimate expression of a standard is, and then I like to work backwards. So for me, in the grades that I would teach, that would be 5th grade if I'm in an elementary school. The ultimate expression of this this with the kids that I teach, given the schedule that I have, is that I would expect students in 5th grade now to go through question formulation technique, which is a protocol you can Google, it's pretty nifty, to formulate rich questions that can lead to deep exploration. That's what I'm going to expect my 5th graders to do. So when I sit down to plan this lesson, this is what I'll be aiming for. My 4th graders are going to do something a little backed off from there. In 4th grade, students will select a topic of personal interest and ask questions to explore further. In 3rd grade, students will select a topic, and notice it's a little different. It doesn't say personal interest. I could ask I could ask their teacher, hey, tell me what you're studying in science over the next 2 weeks, so we could use that as a platform for our inquiry. Or I could do personal interests, depending on what's going on in my school at that time. In 2nd grade, students will select a topic and ask questions to explore further. Hey, Amber, that looks just like 3rd grade. It is. I selected both of these levels of proficiency for 2nd and 3rd grade because this is such an important skill, and because I know a little bit about 2nd and 3rd graders, and I know that they're really curious, and I want to help guide them in using that curiosity to actually fashion questions that are answerable and questions that actually push them to explore and find out the answers to their questions. So I'm going to work on that for 2 years because that is such a big skill. In 1st grade, when given a choice between relevant topics, such as you can do rocks or animals or weather, students will ask questions about the topic they've chosen. I've simplified this a little bit for 1st grade because I know that my 2nd and 3rd graders often have a hard time with just wide open choices, so I'm going to help my 1st graders with that. But my 2nd and 3rd graders need practice in helping to kind of squeeze down on some of those wide open choices and begin to narrow their focus. And my kindergartners will be doing this. When given a subject, like rocks or animals and weather, students will ask questions about the topic at hand. So if I give them something, if I said, boys and girls, today we're going to be talking about weather, I'm going to expect them to be able to ask some questions, and I'm going to coach them around that ask some questions about weather. These are not lesson plans. I would never say, well, here's what I'm doing today, and then get up in front of my class and shoot from the hip. Instead, I'm using this to help me develop lessons, to pull out relevant materials, to plan maybe some centers, to definitely plan the questions that I'm going to be asking of them, and to design the tasks that they're going to do that will help them practice these things that I've defined. In the notes section, I've just jotted some things down that might help me tie in a few things when I get to this particular lesson with a grade level. So, for instance, on grade 2, I said needs to come from science so that I'm more likely to have a resource in nonfiction or Pebble Go. So that's just a note for me to, hey, try to steer them towards something scientific because I have more resources there. For this one, I said needs to happen after introducing World Book Kids and Kids Info Bits, our databases, so they'll have adequate resources to explore. So you can see all over this scope, I've made notes to myself so that I can pull these in at the most opportune time, and I can pull in resources and things that I'm most likely to have. So what I would do is I would fill in this scope for elementary for each one of these different shared foundations. There is an example for middle and high as well, and the middle and high sample scopes look more like the method that I explained earlier, where you talk about perhaps what an introductory exposure versus an intermediate and an advanced exposure might look like. What I called it was level 1 rigor, level 2 rigor, level 3 rigor, and someone even suggested in middle school, even though there are only 3 grades, what if you did a level 4 for your gifted and talented students, or for your students who are looking to maybe earn some extra credit points? I think that could be useful as well. The high school sample looks very similar to middle, but again, yours doesn't need to look anything like this. Yours can hold the information that's going to help you best serve your kids. Okay, let's move on through the table of contents in your workbook, and let's go down to section 2, which is labeled supplemental documents. Subsection A has a group of goodies there that could help you in some daily planning. I'm not going to get into these a whole lot right now because you are probably already clicking through them and looking at them, but I just wanted to talk for a bit about what's in here. In small a, we have just some lesson plan examples. These are some completed lesson plans that your colleagues have provided. It's not to say that any of these is 100% complete, or that any of them would be appropriate for the kids in your program, but if you ever want to say, gosh, I wonder how others indicate what their standards and objectives are going to be, you can look at these examples and get some ideas there. In small letter B, we have some lesson plan templates. If you haven't quite found a lesson planning template that you're comfortable with, one that helps you to map out all of the things that are important to you, there are lots of different flavors of lesson plan templates in that section, and you are free to explore those. And if you find one that you like, I would make several digital copies of those and begin using them or modifying them if you find a few things that you'd like to tweak. In letter C, we have some objective writing support. You've heard me talk about objectives in this session, and if that's something that's a little bit fuzzy to you, you can get some support there to hopefully help you clarify those things. Letter D links out to that objective bank that I mentioned at the beginning of the session. This was the crowdsourced document that we created last year, where folks would record their objectives that they had created from their major and sometimes minor shared foundations. So if you're ever thinking, gosh, I don't know how I would teach this particular competency to this particular grade group, you can look at the objective bank and see if some of your colleagues have posted anything there, and it just might be a good stepping stone for a great lesson idea. We have the informed practice scale, which you can take a look at, and then we have just some terms from Bloom's taxonomies out there that you can refer to as you're doing your planning. So again, these are just resources for you. I think of this section as kind of like the appendix in the back of a textbook or a nonfiction book. This is where the resources are. So again, use the ones that are helpful. If you see something in there that makes you scratch your head, take a moment to try to figure it out. But if it still doesn't make sense, move on to something else. We're going to skip past letter B for a moment. See, we just went through the letter A documents, and now we're skipping over to letter C. We will come back to letter B in just a moment. But letter A that we just looked at was all about daily planning. Letter C is all about kind of background information, general support. These are things that you may have encountered in professional development or things that you've heard your colleagues talk about, and rather than go and fish them out of filing cabinets or search them out of email attachments, you've got them here in one place. So small a there, we have links to other KCS curricula. There's an elementary set of links and a secondary set of links, and when you open those up, You're going to have hyperlinks that'll take you, for instance, to the middle school science curriculum, the elementary school ELA curriculum. That's just a quick set of shortcuts so that you can find out what's going on in those subject areas in case you're collaborating with a teacher or in case you want to coordinate your instruction. Letter B is helpful web links. Some of our curriculum team members curated some links from around the web. As you know, that can be overwhelming. So they've kind of whittled down some top tier links for elementary and secondary librarians. So be sure to check those out. For letter C, we have a variety of inquiry frameworks in here. You may know that there are lots of different quote-unquote programs for inquiry, and some of them use very specific vocabulary and a very specific sequence of events. We don't care which one you use as long as the inquiry is authentic, and you can get lots of ideas for those different frameworks and protocols in letter C. Letter D goes to some accountable talk information. And if you're new to Knox County, this may be unfamiliar to you. Accountable Talk was a program that rolled in about 10 years ago, I think. And it's basically a format for teaching children how to have respectful and structured conversations. And what it looks like on the elementary side is that you give students sentence stems to help them frame comments that they'd like to make back and forth with one another. So, for example, if a student makes a comment in social studies, rather than another student yelling out, that's not true, the Accountable Talk protocol gives them a sentence stem that allows them to frame their comment in words something like this. I hear your comment, Lisa, but I'm thinking that X, Y, and Z are the actual facts. Now, what does that have to do with AASL standards? When you look at the Include and Collaborate Shared Foundation specifically, there's a lot in there about students working together, evaluating perspectives, and sometimes attacking bias and having healthy debate. The Accountable Talk sentence stems would be great vehicles for teaching children how to work together in those ways. We have that equip protocol that I mentioned back at the beginning of the session. Again, this is the full protocol in case you hear anyone at your building talking about it or if you just want to learn more. But again, we will be using elements of the protocol throughout the year. So if you see that whole thing, don't panic. Letter F is Hattie's Visible Learning. That's another district initiative. John Hattie is a meta researcher. He looks at different educational research and tries to find out what structures and practices have the highest impact on students, and so you can see those there. I have the feeling that our district is going to go deeper and deeper into that, so it would be wonderful if you already know a bit about visible learning so that you can join in on those conversations. We have a copy of our Library Media Specialist Team rubric, which is hopefully not new to anyone. We have a document that has ELA standards. It's an ELA standards document, but we have highlighted some of the standards that are very library media flavored. So the standards in ELA where they are asked to research, evaluate sources and those kinds of things, that's highlighted in here just because they provide a really good stepping stone for developing collaborative lessons and relationships with your ELA teachers. We have the AASL standards crosswalks that link up the learner standards to future ready frameworks, ISTE standards, and that sort of thing. We have Tennessee social and personal competencies, kind of like Accountable Talk in their purpose. We are trying to teach students more civilized ways to respond to other people, and so this is a great tool for finding out what is deemed age appropriate for each grade level. And then we have a verb chart for shared foundations that really help you kind of drill down to the heart of what students are being asked to do in each of our learner standards. Again, you can click through these and get a really good idea of what's in there and what may or may not be useful for you. But again, this is, like I said before, this is like your library of resources. There may be some items in here that you will return to again and again. There may be some that you don't pick up, just like a regular library. That is okay. Letters D and E. Let's talk about those for a second. Letter D has an area where you can collect student work. Some folks like to analyze student work to see how effective their planning and teaching was. Other folks like to collect student work in a portfolio type manner so that they can talk to their teachers and administrators about what kinds of progress is being made with students in their participation in library programs. Other folks said, you know what, I don't see myself using that as a student work repository. I see this space as a place where I can house all of my, my task cards, my worksheets, my maps or diagrams that I use in instruction. Kind of like a big digital filing cabinet. You use it for whatever will best serve you. Letter E is text sets. Our ELA department in K-5 and 612, elementary and secondary, they have texts that go along with their ELA units. For K-5, they have texts that complement their basals, and we have those pulled out. They're usually additional picture books, sometimes informational text, but mostly picture books. That you could maybe read aloud or use as the basis of your instruction to complement what's going on in their ELA classrooms. For secondary, they do not have a true basal. They root their instruction in authentic literature, and often the selection of that literature is up to the teacher. So we have a list of some of the novels that are frequently chosen by teachers so that you can know what they're going to be reading. Sometimes students will come into the library wanting to know, if you have an extra copy or if you have anything else by that author, so that's good information to have. So that takes us to the end of our table of contents, but we now need to circle back up to letter B. Letter B is about long-range planning. You're going to find lots of things in here, but small letter C is the one I really want to drill in on for the next few minutes. So letter A is a standards checklist. This is all of our competencies kind of listed out in a place for you to mark which grade levels those have been taught to. I would highly discourage you from using this checklist as a check, taught it, never have to do that one again for a particular grade level, because we know that that's not how students learn. We need to continually revisit important concepts so that students have a chance to spiral back to them and make their knowledge more concrete. Instead, I would probably use this as a map for when it was taught. Maybe I taught it to this class on this date, and then we did a review of it out here on this date, and then maybe we applied it in a different project out here on this date, just so you can see that, yes, I have attacked this standard multiple times with this particular group, and you can also use it to see, oh my goodness, I haven't provided these kids very many opportunities in, let's say, for instance, the Engage Shared Foundation. I don't have any dates in those boxes, so perhaps I need to develop some lessons so that students have an opportunity to learn those things. There are some planning calendars where you can sketch out what a whole week or month might look like. We're going to come back to letter C in just a second. Letter D seems to be popular for folks. This is a planning map by content areas pacing. So it's the map of the school year, August to May, and it has for the different subjects that are taught at your school, the topics that will be covered during particular months. So you can see what, let's say for instance, what fifth grade is doing in reading in August, what they're doing in social studies in August, math in August, and science in August, so that when you're planning your August instruction, you could possibly tie into what those students are doing in their classrooms. It gets a little bit trickier in high school, simply because a lot of those kids are taking courses that are on a semester, so the pacing is different. Whether a kid has it in the fall semester or the spring semester, but you can see the sequence of events, and you'll at least know how the course is going to unfold, so that you could talk with those teachers about that content if you were asked to join in on some collaborative instruction. There is a collaboration log for those of you who like to track how frequently you're getting the opportunity to work with others in your building. This is a place for you to record that. It could even be super useful from year to year as you look back and say, okay, last April, Miss So-and-so asked me to help her with their family tree project. So I'm going to go ahead and prepare. I'm going to maybe go ahead and gather some websites or free trials to some ancestry type platforms, so that if she comes to me with that, we're ready to go. So it can kind of be also used as a historical record, so that you can plan going forward. Letter C, the sequence. The reason I skipped that is because this is kind of a big one, and it is a partner to that big hairy scope we looked at just a few minutes ago. I'm going to skip that. Nope, come on back here. So the sequence, and I'm going to pull mine up. Okay, I need to go back a layer, and let me revisit that. That's in folder B, which is in section 2. Aha. The sequence is where I'm going to take all of those things that I plotted out on my scope. Let's see here. Here's my scope, my sample scope. Here's where I'm going to take these things and put them in a logical order. So, for example, let me get back here to the elementary side. Let me get back over here. Oops, I hit the wrong one. Okay, so let's say that I'm teaching second grade, and I'm working towards having students select a topic and ask questions to explore further. Let's say I'm teaching that for the next 2 class visits, and I'm going to focus on some science topics. So I might let them choose between mammals, amphibians, reptiles, birds, fish, that sort of thing. I'm going to take a look across my scope. And again, I would look at the different tabs that I have down here, but my sample only has 1. If you were really doing this, you'd look across all of your shared foundations. But I'm going to see if there's anything that's super logical in coming next. So, oh my gosh, this is perfect. And it makes sense because we're in the same shared foundation. So if I've spent 2 class periods having them ask questions, my next logical thing would be to have them practice using sources to answer those questions. And then maybe later on, when I get over to my engaged shared foundation, I might see some learning activities I had defined there about respecting authorship. So I might find a way to bring in the next lesson as a way to talk about intellectual property and citations and that sort of thing. But for now, I've just got these two to look at, and so I'm going to just focus my attention here. What I would do in my sequence, might take me a minute, yep, here it is. So they're tabbed across the bottom. I'm going to go to second grade. I've already got a few examples in there, but I might say, okay, this is, I'm talking in October, but I'm looking ahead to November because I already have my October lessons planned. So my first lesson in November will be from, so I'm going to go back to my scope here. I'm going to list the shared foundation that I would be working on, and it's this one. So all I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy this text, okay, and I'm just going to paste it in here. Oh, it gave me a color. I'm just going to take that off. And then I'm going to make a note of my specific idea here, just so I don't forget that. So I'm going to add this to it. Okay, and this is going to be, I'm going to wrap that text. This is going to be my lesson 2 as well, because remember I said this is probably going to take 2 times, so I'm going to put this in here. And then my third lesson, I've said, okay, this makes the most sense to happen next, so it's this shared foundation. Go back over here, lesson 3. Scoot out a bit, okay, and then I'm going to add my note so I'll remember what my intention was. Oops, this one, grade 2. I'm going to add that to it and write that text. So now I know the basic bones of what my lesson's going to look like. Now, I don't have very many facts or specifics here. I haven't defined what kids are going to be asking questions about. I came up with some ideas a few minutes ago, but I need to define that. I haven't defined what product they're going to create during this lesson. Haven't done that for any of these, but I at least have the bones there. Now, if what I just did seemed a little scrambly to you, all that toggling back and forth and copying and pasting, I'm sure it did look that way. But my whole purpose for creating this sequence that relies on the scope, which is also a very big undertaking, is this. When you're engaged in lesson planning on a regular basis, whether it's daily, whether it's every 4 days, however frequently you have to plan a new group of lessons, it can be very intimidating to sit down and say, okay, what do I do next? When you have 60-something standards in front of you, it is very daunting to choose what comes next. So the thinking behind the scope and sequence being developed by you is that if you can do this kind of thinking in big chunks, if you can work on this some during the summer, if you can work on it throughout the school year, a little chunk at a time, eventually you will have a document that takes all that, oh my gosh, what do I do now, out of your planning. You will have a clear roadmap in front of you, and you will reduce a lot of your decision fatigue. Now, will you experience decision fatigue as you're planning these documents, as you're creating them from scratch? Probably so. But the thinking is, it might be more comfortable for some of you to experience that decision fatigue in a really concentrated manner on the front end of developing the scope and sequence, so that you don't have to experience it on a daily basis as you engage in regular planning. That may be not very comfortable for some people. It may be really liberating for other people. You are not required to do any of this long-range planning work. Let me say that again. You are not required to do any of this long-range planning work. You are required to do daily planning work. You do have to have high quality lessons and activities for your kids on, as frequently as you see them. But you are not being asked to generate this scope and sequence and turn it into someone. Instead, these tools are being offered to you as vehicles for revolutionizing your planning practices. That's one thing I hear most commonly is that, oh, the lesson planning just gets me. I have to come up with fresh ideas for 6th grade levels every 4 days or whatever your schedule might be. This is a way for you to automate a bit of that. Also, it's a self-check so that you can ensure that, hey, did I just teach my kids in choir this year? Do I have a way of knowing, how well I spread out my lessons across the standards framework? Did I just keep my kids up in the think domain? Did I give them any opportunities to go deeper into create and share and grow? Now, of course, you could look back at your lesson plans and determine whether or not you had done that, but it would be wonderful for you to know those things ahead of time and plan in such a way that helps you deliberately accomplish those things. It would be much better to have a strategy like this scope and sequence on the front end to help you ensure that you did cover all 6 shared foundations and many of the different domains as you present instruction to your kids, as opposed to getting to the end of the year and saying, oh man, somehow I managed to not teach very much from Collaborate this year. As we seek to give children a broad range of experiences, we want to make sure that we have a strategy for keeping ourselves accountable to teaching across our standards framework. So let's go back to our workbooks. Skip that. So you've seen that you now have a pretty hefty set of planning tools at your disposal. Some of you may be excited by them. Some of you may be overwhelmed by them. Again, I can't say this enough. There is no expectation that you churn out all of these documents as some sort of assignment. Instead, we would love to see you using them as they serve you, as you serve your students and teachers. If you are new to librarianship, or if you haven't been in a library that required you to engage in a whole lot of instruction in a while, this may not be something that you can tackle reasonably right out of the gate. But eventually, I hope that you may grow to see the benefits of thinking about instruction in these long-range plans, and then begin creating these work products that are going to help you get there. The good news is you are not alone. You see collaboration on your screen here. Because Google Drive is digital and has all sorts of sharing features built in, you are certainly able and invited to collaborate with your colleagues in working on this type of these types of planning documents. If there's someone that you know that you would be a good partner with, there's no reason why the two of you couldn't share your workbooks with one another. You could peek at hers, she could peek at yours. You could even contribute to each other's workbooks with good ideas. Again, we have so much expertise, but it's spread out so thinly. And for most of you, you're the only librarian in your building, so it's really, really hard to get any feedback or inspiration from one another. So please take advantage of the anatomy of these tools to get some assistance and some support as you're working through them. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I want to review our objectives to make sure we got where we wanted to go. Did we reflect on year 1 and understand year 2 of AASL standards implementation for our Knox County Library Media Services program? I believe we did. Did we become familiar with planning tools? We sure spent a lot of time on that. And did we engage in planning using the tools in the workbook? Not yet. You saw me model how I would use some of the tools and pulling things together, planning and using those to create a map. You haven't yet had the opportunity to do that. But after you close out this session, while this information is still fresh on your mind, I encourage you to open up your workbook, locate some of those tools that looked helpful and enticing to you, and spend some time thinking through what you might enter into those tools and what you might get out of them later. In other words, what time and effort could I spend right now developing in some of these tools so that I could reap the benefits from them later on? We will have additional sessions throughout the school year where we focus on standards. We have online lesson planning sessions that are announced via email. We try to have those about once a month that you can participate in. You can come together virtually with some of your colleagues and talk about what a particular shared foundation might mean, how other people have taught it in their programs. At District Learning Days, we will continue to focus on the standards, so I hope that you'll take the opportunity to participate in those things, and do remember to please reach out to me or Sarah Searles or any of your colleagues, and we will help you as best we can. Thank you for your time and attention.